Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, February 15th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Netanyahu vetoes further hostage deal talks. So the Times of Israel reported on Wednesday that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vetoed hostage deal talks without consulting his war cabinet, infuriating families of Israeli hostages in Gaza. So Netanyahu said no more talks on a potential hostage deal with Hamas. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum, which is a group representing relatives of most of the Israeli hostages in Gaza, said that it was stunned by Netanyahu's move to end the talks. The group said in a statement, quote, "It appears that some of the members of the cabinet decided to sacrifice the lives of the hostages without admitting it," end quote. The group also said that it was a death sentence for the Israeli captives who remain in Gaza. Israeli media is reporting that War Cabinet members Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot of the National Unity Party are furious over Netanyahu's move, and they met on Wednesday to discuss their response. So Gantz, is an opposition figure. He was a defense minister in a previous Netanyahu government a few years ago. It was a coalition deal. He was supposed to take over as prime minister eventually, but that government was dissolved. So he joined the War Cabinet when this thing first, when things first started in October. So he's not happy about Netanyahu doing this. And the veto came after Mossad chief David Barnea met with U.S., Egyptian, and Qatari officials in Cairo on Tuesday to discuss a potential hostage deal. And before the meeting, as I covered yesterday, Netanyahu rejected an outline for a proposal that was drawn up by his, top-level Israeli military and intelligence officials. He said, no, don't propose that. Only go to the talks to listen and do not offer any new proposals. So Egypt and Qatar were looking to hold another meeting on Thursday, but Israel has said it will not attend. And in Israel's absence, Hamas officials are now expected to go to Cairo for this meeting. But who knows what, is going to come of it. If it sounds like, the Israelis are just completely not participating now in these talks. And the last proposal that was offered by Hamas was for the 135-day truce. It included, 3 phases. And the goal would be to release all the Israeli hostages. They wanted to release about 1,500 Palestinian prisoners. And eventually the idea was to take the time of the ceasefire to work toward a permanent ceasefire. But that's not what Netanyahu wants. When it comes to Netanyahu's personal interests, not the interests of the hostage families, not the interest of Israel, not in, many people's interests beside his own. He wants to continue this slaughter in Gaza because he knows his political career is in jeopardy once this ends. The majority of Israelis support this, horrific slaughter that's taking place in Gaza, according to polls. But the polling also shows that they want Netanyahu out of there once it's over. So, of course, he has all the interest. And this is something Biden apparently said, in one of these stories about him expressing his frustrations with Netanyahu. He's so frustrated that he keeps sending him bombs to wage this thing. But anyway, in one of those reports, it said that Biden said that he thinks this Netanyahu wants to continue the war for his own interests, for his own political career. And regardless of that, Biden is still supporting this thing, completely. And now this is as Netanyahu saying that they're going to go into Rafah next, which is packed with so many Palestinians sheltering on the streets. And the U.S. has essentially given them the green light by saying they will not impose any consequences on Israel if they invade Rafah and kill a bunch of civilians. All right, so the next one here, Israeli airstrikes kill 9 civilians in Lebanon. So this article is from Jason Ditz, and it says that 9 Lebanese civilians were killed and a substantial number of others were wounded as an escalation of strikes was carried out by both sides across the border. Hezbollah was presumed to be carrying out the rocket fire on Israel on Wednesday morning, but apparently they didn't formally announce that they launched those rocket strikes before Israel's retaliation. So Israel responded, and they said that they launched an extensive wave of attacks, hitting mostly towns in southern Lebanon. And now this was being reported, I know, by some places as the heaviest Israeli bombing of Lebanon yet, since this latest flare-up. And Israeli attacks killed a mother and her 2 children, and altogether, Lebanese hospital officials said that 9 civilians, including 4 children, were slain in a handful of towns, and 4 Hezbollah members were also reported killed. The attacks against Israel focused on a military base in Safed, though a building in the city itself was hit by rockets, and a female Israeli IDF soldier was killed, and 8 other soldiers were killed in the Hezbollah attacks. So this is more of just that tit-for-tat escalation across the border, and it seems like Israel really ramped things up with these big airstrikes. So who knows what Hezbollah's response is going to be, if they're going to take things up another notch as well. Certainly something that can really blow up into a full-blown war. And that's another thing. There's been reports that say U.S. officials are worried that Netanyahu might see a war in Lebanon, a full-scale war, as key to his political survival. All right, so the next one here. Israel is surveilling U.S. data on settler attacks to thwart sanctions. So this article is from 972 magazine. And basically what it says is Israel is spying on the U.S. On their communications with the Palestinian Authority. So the article says Israel has been surveilling information provided to the United States by the Palestinian Authority regarding settler violence in the occupied West Bank in recent months. And this is 972 magazine, which is an Israeli magazine, is reporting this, citing sources in Israeli intelligence. They say that they have been tracking materials passed through private channels by the PA to the Office of U.S. Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestine Authority in Jerusalem. That's where that U.S. office is based. And why they're spying, tracking these communications is to understand what the U.S. knows about settler violence. The intention, these sources explained, is not to act against the perpetrators, but to prevent the collected information from developing into sanctions. So essentially what they want to know is what the U.S. is finding out and how they can kind of explain themselves, I guess, or kind of get ahead of what the U.S. is going to bring to them so they could try to avoid the sanctions. U.S. officials who confirmed that PA officials have been sending a great deal of information to them on incidents of settler violence told 972 that this information contributed in part to President Biden's decision earlier this month to impose sanctions against 4 settlers known to have attacked Palestinians and left-wing Israeli activists. The officials added that the information led in recent months to the inclusion of dozens of other settlers on a blacklist prohibiting their entry into the United States. So since October 7th, there's been a huge spike in Israeli settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank and Israeli military violence as well. But the settlers are really trying to take advantage of the tensions and of all the attention on Gaza so they can take over more Palestinian land and homes. All right, so I left up the one from yesterday about the U.S. giving Israel the green light to kill civilians in Rafah. The next one here, heavy U.S. bombing reported in Yemen's Hodeidah. So a series of U.S. and British airstrikes were reported in Yemen's western province of Hodeidah, which is on the Red Sea. And there's also a city by the same name. That's a big port city on the Red Sea. So a correspondent for Al Mayadeen, which is they're based in Lebanon, but they have reporters in Yemen. And they reported that Hodeidah was hit at least 9 times throughout the day. Yemen's Sabah news agency reported that U.S. and British strikes on Hodeidah continued into Wednesday evening, hitting several areas of the province. So far, the U.S. military has not announced the strikes, but U.S. Central Command typically puts out press releases a few hours after they're finished, or sometimes they wait until the following day to officially announce these strikes. On Wednesday morning, CENTCOM announced that it launched a strike against Houthi-controlled Yemen a day earlier, but did not specify where. So that was on Tuesday, and then these new strikes are on Wednesday. So this continues a very heavy bombing campaign. The command, so in the strikes, I hope I'm not confusing you here, but in the strikes that CENTCOM did announce that happened on Tuesday, they claimed, as they have been, that they hit a missile that was preparing to launch. And a few hours later, the Houthis fired a missile into the Gulf of Aden. So it really shows how, the U.S. strikes are not stopping the Houthis from still being able to fire missiles and drones. So since January 12th, the U.S. has launched around 30 rounds of missile strikes on Yemen. And some of these have been heavy bombings that hit, dozens of targets. And those are usually conducted with the UK. Others have been unilateral U.S. strikes against a single target. So according to the Houthis, by their count, the U.S. and the UK have conducted a total of 403 attacks on Yemen. So that sounds like they're saying 403 actual strikes. And I think that based on the number of rounds of airstrikes, and they're also launching strikes from warships in the Red Sea, I think that's a believable number. They actually said specifically 203 of them were airstrikes, so that means launched from planes, while the rest could have been launched from warships in the Red Sea. And the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah, have shown no sign that they will back down in the face of the U.S. military. And just for context, that I know I often include, that the Houthis are the governing force in North Yemen, what used to be the country of North Yemen. They control most of that territory. It's really, if you look at a map, it's Western Yemen, but it's north areas as well. And that's where 70 to 80% of Yemen's population lives. So where the majority of Yemenis live under the Houthis. All right, so the next one here, the UAE is restricting the U.S.'s ability to launch airstrikes from its territory. So the UAE and other Arab nations are increasingly restricting the U.S.'s ability to launch airstrikes from their soil, as the U.S. has been bombing Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So this was reported by Politico on Wednesday. The U.S. relies on its military presence in these Arab countries, in several of these Arab Gulf nations like the UAE, like Qatar, to support its wars and military operations in the Middle East. Basing and overflights are being restricted as the populations of the Arab states don't want to appear too supportive of the U.S. as it backs the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. And another country that's come under a lot of heat from its population is Jordan. The Jordanian government has been coming under increasing pressure from its citizens and members of its parliament over its military relationship with the U.S., especially after 3 U.S. troops were killed at a secretive base in northeast Jordan on the Syrian border, a base that the Jordanian government never officially acknowledged exists until they mentioned it in a statement after the 3 U.S. troops were killed. So sources told Politico that another reason the UAE and other unnamed Arab states are restricting U.S. operations is because they seek better relations with Iran. One Western official said, quote, "They don't want to appear like they're against Iran, and they don't want to appear too close to the West and Israel for public opinion reasons," end quote. So the UAE and Kuwait, they restored diplomatic relations with Iran back in 2022, and that was followed by Saudi Arabia last year. And the diplomatic push threw a wrench into big plans that the U.S. and Israel had for the region. These Abraham Accords, which they call the normalization deals Israel signed with the UAE and Bahrain, a big aspect of them was they wanted to create this anti-Iran alliance, kind of NATO-style alliance in the Middle East between Israel and the Gulf Arab nations. But they're starting to choose diplomacy instead, and that's something I know, Israel has not been very happy about, and the U.S. as well. And, it's interesting. The U.S. supported the UAE and the Saudis against the Houthis for all these years in a brutal war in Yemen, but neither of them, the UAE or Saudi Arabia, show any interest in getting involved in this new U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, which is just really unbelievable because for so long they were just pushing for more U.S. support, more U.S. weapons so they could keep going after the Houthis. But the Houthis got really good at hitting their oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, and they hit the UAE as well, and that's something that they do not want to happen again. So, all right, so the next one here, Air Force overhaul to prepare for war with China. So the U.S. Air Force and Space Force announced a plan for a major overhaul of force structures to prepare for a future war with China in the Asia-Pacific. So even though they got all this going on in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Middle East in general, they're still preparing for this future confrontation with China. So the plan was announced on Monday by Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall and other officials, and it includes a total of 24 changes, including 16 for the Air Force, 5 for the Space Force, and 3 for the entire Department of the Air Force, which the Space Force falls under. So Kendall said at a Air Force, some sort of symposium this week, he said, quote, "We are out of time. Why do I say that? It's not that I enjoy sounding like a broken record. It's because for the last 2 decades, China has been building a military that is designed, purpose-built to deter and defeat the United States if we intervene in the Western Pacific," end quote. So according to military.com, the majority of these changes are kind of vague and just renaming things and rebranding efforts aimed at focusing on what they call great power competition. But some of the changes are significant, including bringing back warrant officers, which have not existed in the Air Force for 65 years. So as far as I understand it, a warrant officer is usually, one level above the enlisted, but below commissioned officers. And they want to bring back this position specifically for them to focus on information and technology warfare. So Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin said that the idea of bringing back the rank is to have airmen who want to code for the country and be network attack people. That's how he put it. So it sounds like cyber operations and things like that. And he also said another thing that they're trying to focus on is large-scale military exercises instead of the smaller-scale drills that it has prioritized for the past few decades, sort of counter-terrorism stuff. Now they're preparing for the big one with China as well as Russia. So Kendall, the Air Force Secretary, has made it very clear that China is his big focus. And again, despite Ukraine and Gaza, that still, according to all the Pentagon's strategy documents that they've published in recent years, they say the number one threat is China. Russia's number 2. And then you have, all these other things. Actually, I believe Iran and North Korea are next. And then below that is groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, even though, the U.S. has been bombing Somalia. Al-Shabaab wasn't even, mentioned by name, I don't think, I think it was the national security, at least the declassified version of the National Defense Strategy. But anyway, so Kendall, I've been kind of following him for a few years now since he became the Air Force Secretary, just because he says some pretty ridiculous things. Right after he was sworn in, Kendall said, quote, "So what are my intentions now that I have this job? At a breakfast on Capitol Hill shortly after I was sworn in, I was asked by Senator John Tester what my priorities were. My answer was that I have 3, China, China, and China," end quote. And he's also said things like, he wants the Air Force to develop capabilities to scare China. He's very China-focused. All right, so the next one here, the House's top China hawk will lead a congressional delegation to Taiwan. So Representative Mike Gallagher, he's a Republican from Wisconsin. He's the hawkish head of the House's China Committee, which was formed last year. He will lead a congressional delegation to Taiwan later this month in a move that is sure to anger China. This was reported by the Financial Times on Tuesday. So the visit is meant as a show of support for Lai Ching-te, who is Taiwan's vice president, and he won the elections in January and will be sworn in as president in May. Lai is of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. He has been denounced by Beijing as a dangerous separatist and is expected to continue moving Taiwan closer to the U.S. Gallagher's delegation is also expected to meet with Han Kuo-yu of the opposition Kuomintang Party, who secured the speaker position in Taiwan's parliament. So because the Kuomintang is more friendly toward Beijing, the fact that the Kuomintang has the speakership could make things a little more difficult for the DPP when it comes to passing legislation that moves toward formal independence. And that's not something, I don't think that they're going to formally declare independence, because it's kind of just a provocation that wouldn't really change much. But they are going to continue to, move closer to the U.S. and get more support from the U.S. And the really crazy story that I covered recently was that the U.S. deployed military advisors, according to Taiwanese media, to the Kinmen Islands, which are controlled by Taiwan, but 2.5 miles off the coast of mainland China. It's really insane. And when I asked the Pentagon about it, they did not deny it. They just said they couldn't comment on military operations in Taiwan. So it basically means that, there's U.S. military advisors, which are probably special operations forces, right off the coast of China, a potential tripwire. The Financial Times report said that Gallagher will arrive in Taiwan on February 21st. Analysts told the South China Morning Post that China will likely respond to Gallagher's trip and meeting with Lai, but is not expected to launch major military exercises in response, as Beijing did when Nancy Pelosi went there back in August 2022 when she was the House Speaker. The House Speaker going over there really angers China. They're against any sort of contacts between Taiwanese and U.S. officials, but we'll see the bigger response from the House Speaker going over there, the higher level officials. So the House's new China committee, again, it was formed last year, and they've been pushing very aggressive policies toward Beijing. Under Gallagher's leadership, the panel has called to significantly increase support for Taiwan, and Gallagher is actually not running for re-election, so that means he's going to be out of there by 2025, in 2025 when the new Congress comes in. But he is not, going to be hard to replace. Just the attitude in Congress, they're all China hawks for the most part, pretty much all of them. And, there's some that sound even more hysterical than Gallagher does. So again, he's just not going to be, it's not going to be hard to find someone like him to take over. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to deploy 5 aircraft carriers to the Western Pacific. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it says that the U.S. is likely to deploy nearly half of its aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific this year in a signal of deterrence against the increasing military activity by China and North Korea. They call this deterrence, but really, it's provocation. The Chinese and North Korean military activity is a response, and they're just in this cycle of escalation. China increases its military drills, or North Korea fires some missiles, and then the U.S. and South Korea, or whatever area it is, it's just a cycle of escalating military activity. And 3 U.S. aircraft carriers are already operating in the Western Pacific Ocean, with 2 more on the way, and their arrival will mark the first time that 5 of the 11-strong carrier contingent have operated in the region, what they call the Western Pacific, and that includes Hawaii, Guam. This doesn't mean that they're all right up in the South China Sea, but it means that they're going to be much more active in that area. And it shows, again, the priority. This is probably kind of saying, look, see, we're still, even though we're funding this war in Gaza and everything, Ukraine, we're still focused over there. We're still going to stick our aircraft carriers under your nose. All right, so the next one here. Amnesty says drop the charges against Julian Assange. So this article is from Brett Wilkins. And Amnesty International on Tuesday renewed its call for the U.S. government to drop charges against jailed WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, whose final hearing before the United Kingdom's High Court regarding his extradition to the U.S. is fast approaching. So Assange's hearing, which is expected to be his final hearing to appeal extradition to the United States, where if he's convicted, he could do he's facing up to 175 years in prison for his journalistic activities for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing documents he obtained from Chelsea Manning from a whistleblower, which is a standard journalistic activity. So this would just huge implications for the press freedom in this country and around the world because the U.S. is extraditing him. So the hearing is February 20th and the 21st. So Amnesty has been calling for the charges to be dropped against Assange, and they're kind of making the call again. So I think it's important for us to focus on this. And one thing I know, like Assange's wife and Assange activists, the thing that they want Americans to do is basically call their representatives and senators and just bug them about this and tell them, I know there's a resolution in the House that calls for the U.S. to drop the charges against Assange. That's something you could do, is call your House rep and say, hey, support this resolution. It's a huge threat to our freedoms, to the First Amendment. So it's, hopefully, I don't know, this kind of stuff makes a difference when it comes to the ruling of the High Court in the UK. All right, so the next one here, Australian MPs vote overwhelmingly for freedom for Assange. So this article is from The Cradle, and Australian members of parliament, including Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, or Albanese, as the Australians pronounce it, and members of his cabinet have voted overwhelmingly in favor of urging the US and UK to allow embattled WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to return to his home country of Australia. Independent MP Andrew Wilkie, I know he's been very good, very up front when it comes to the opposition to the U.S. extradition in Australia's parliament. He praised the vote as an unprecedented show of political support for Assange by the Australian parliament. Wilkie added that it was time for all of parliament to take a stand and support the motion. So apparently the vote was 86 in favor of freeing Assange and 42 against, which I don't understand how I guess I understand it because Australia has been under the thumb of the U.S. for a long time now. But to vote against freedom of an Australian citizen who's being wrongly imprisoned for doing journalism, voting against that, just really shameful stuff. I know there's a few Australians that listen to this show, so I'm sure you know who the people are who are voting against that. But again, more pressure. The Australian government has been lobbying the U.S., so hopefully some of this pressure works and we can pile onto it by bugging our representatives. All right, so the last story here, what ISIS threat? Washington says that there is none. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft, and basically there is a report from a U.S. government watchdog that says ISIS is depleted, they're not a big threat, no threat to the American homeland. So basically all this talk that's how the U.S. still justifies its presence in Iraq and Syria, even though it's clearly not about ISIS. It's clearly about countering Iran and their allies, the Shia militias who operate in Iraq and in eastern Syria. So this report, it paints a dismal picture of the once powerful ISIS's operations in Iraq and Syria, where it controlled huge swaths of territory in the mid-2010s. The watchdog says, quote, ISIS's capacity to conduct insurgent activities remain severely degraded in Iraq and Syria, end quote. And also ISIS attacks have significantly dropped since 2020. And the group's operations now appear more akin to a failing crime syndicate than a powerful terror group. Crackdowns on ISIS finances have left the organization unable to consistently pay its fighters. The report said that ISIS leaders are paid only sporadically, so just not a cohesive group. Just these remnants remain in these rural areas of Iraq and Syria. So that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Daniel Larison. Biden's call for Israel to mind the laws appear feeble and ignored. One from Ted Snyder. Joe Biden and mismanagement of the wars. One from W. James Antle. Biden is slowly losing the NATO argument to Trump. And one from Jacob G. Hornberger, America's Military Empire. The spotlight is from Daniel DePetris. U.S. policy on the Houthis is the definition of insanity. So please go check all that out. You could support this show by telling your friends about it, sharing it, telling people to go to antiwar.com. Follow us on Instagram. There's a lot going on over there now. Some really great posts. At AntiWarCom is the handle. Follow us on Twitter at AntiWarCom as well. You can follow me on Twitter at DeCampDave. You know, a little engagement over there on Instagram, on Twitter. That stuff helps out. I'll be back tomorrow. One more show this week. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.